Dear friends, this is second part of the striped terror of Chamala Valley. Let's listen this story described by Kenneth Anderson as thus. And I was right. I covered the 100 yards rapidly, and after another 25 yards I judged that I must now be pretty near the tiger and that it was time to redouble my caution. Momentarily, I glanced back at the langur watchman. He was looking intently in my direction, confirming the fact that both the tiger and myself were now in the same area of his vision. Freezing again, I listened and watched minutely the space before me, and on either side. It consisted of the usual clumps of thorn bush, interspersed by short glades of speargrass, about 4 foot high. As I watched, I saw a slight movement of the grass to my left, about 30 yards away. I raised myself in order to get a better view, and the tiger saw me. A low growl followed by 2 bounds, and he had disappeared. I knew it was now both futile and dangerous to follow him, having made him aware of my presence and the fact that he was being followed. Cautiously guarding my rear against a surprise attack, I crept back towards the thicket in which I knew the kill was lying, and I soon found it. The calf had been half-eaten, it was resting on its left side, sheltered by the grass and thicket from vultures, and very fortunately overlooked by a wild mango tree. I had now to make a quick decision. There was a chance of the tiger returning to his kill, in spite of having seen me, which I would miss if I were to lose this opportunity of sitting up for him. At the same time, I had not come equipped for a night vigil, and was carrying no torch, blanket or food. If I decided to sit up, I would have to remain in the tree till morning, as the nights were dark at that time and there was no moon. It would hardly be possible to negotiate the pitch-black forest and return to my car at Pulibanu, apart from the fact that I would be entirely at the man-eater's mercy. If I remained, I was in for a night of extreme discomfort in the bitterly cold breeze that would blow down from the escarpment, against which I could not shield myself. I thought of going back to the car to get the necessary things. The distance was roughly 4 miles each way, and I feared the tiger might come back in my absence and entirely remove the kill. Finally, I decided to abandon all thought of personal discomfort and sit it out. Ascending the mango tree, I settled myself in its second fork, where I was able to be fairly comfortable with my back against a branch. I folded my feet crosswise, in Indian fashion, after removing my shoes, and stood the cocked rifle against the branch before me. From this position I had a clear view of the kill to my left, then an interruption by the branch before me, then another view, then a branch, then a view over my right shoulder at an angle from which it was impossible to shoot, and finally the branch against which my back rested. This precluded any view of the rear. At the same time I was about 15 feet from the ground and safe from the tiger's spring. To reach me he would have to pass the first crotch in the tree, where he would be almost at point-blank range. The time was 12:50 p.m., and I settled down to what I felt would become one of the coldest and most unendurable vigils of my whole career as a hunter. I will not weary my readers by recounting how the hours dragged by until 6:30 p.m., when the fowl and day birds of the forest had gone to roost, and the langurs had long since moved away from the hated presence of their 2 enemies, tiger and man. I was alone, except for an occasional nightjar that flitted, chirping, around my tree. At 6:45 p.m. it was almost dark. The nightjar had now settled below me, and commenced its squatting call of chucku-chucku-chucku, when I met one of the strange experiences that sometimes, but very rarely, fall to the lot of a wanderer in the Indian forests. I had been told stories by jungle men, and had also read that tigers, in particular localities only, imitate sombre and emit the belling call of a stag, presumably to decoy other animals of the same species to them, particularly the does. I had never placed much credence in this story, and never experienced it myself. That evening, shortly after 6:45, the sudden solitary dank of a sombre stag rang out from a thicket in the waning light, in the space still visible between the branch against which my rifle rested before me, and that immediately to the right, and from out of this thicket almost simultaneously stepped the tiger. Now there could not have been any sombre stag in that thicket, along with or just in front of the tiger, for I could not have missed its hoof beats as it ran from the spot. No sombre would have stood there and allowed the tiger practically to touch it in passing. Beyond that one dank 9 there was no other sound, when, as I have said, the tiger stepped into the open, and there was no possible doubt that the tiger had made the sound. Why it did so is a mystery, as it was not hunting. It had fed well earlier that morning and was now returning to another repast, so that there could have been no thought in its mind of decoying a somber by imitating its call. I can only recount what actually happened, and what I experienced, and the fact that, beyond doubt, there was no somber in that thicket when the tiger stepped out. I leave the rest to your own conjecture and conclusion. For my part, having heard it with my own ears, I have no alternative but to believe the old tales I had read and heard of a tiger's ability to mimic this sound. The animal walked towards the kill and was lost to view behind the branch before me, which opportunity one seized to get my rifle into position. It then reappeared to my left, and very shortly seized the kill in its jaws and lifted it. My shot struck it squarely behind the left shoulder. It spun around to receive my next shot in the neck, then collapsed, kicked and twitched for another minute, and was still. The tiger being dead, I now felt that it was safe for me to walk to the car, provided I could find my way in the darkness. With all the difficulties involved, I felt this to be preferable to sitting all night in the tree, cramped and shivering, with the cold and on an empty stomach. Abruptly making up my mind, I shinned down the tree without approaching the tiger, and hurried off to find the bed of the Kalyani River before total darkness set in, for I realized it would be possible, even in darkness, to stumble along the bed of the dry river which would ultimately bring me to Pulibinu and the car, although the distance would be about 6 miles through all the bends of the river. I would almost surely lose the narrow footpath, the only alternative, in the darkness, and have to spend the night in the jungle. Trying to negotiate the stony bed of the Kalyani in darkness proved a real nightmare. On many occasions I slipped on the rounded boulders that strewed the bed of the stream in profusion, or barked my shins against hidden tree stumps and rocks. More than once I was in danger of twisting an ankle, or perhaps breaking a leg in jumping from one boulder to another, and twice I fell while holding my precious rifle aloft to prevent dashing it against the rocks. The journey required absolute concentration, and it took me 4 hours to reach Pulibinu, stepping into the car at 10 minutes past 11 p.m. You may suppose that in driving back to Nagapatla I was congratulating myself on having slain the man-eater. But in actual fact I was not, for many circumstances forced themselves on my mind and made me uneasy as to the degree of success I had achieved. First, the tiger had killed a buffalo bait. Second, it had remained at that bait when discovered by me and then casually retreated, with me following. Third, after becoming aware of my presence it had turned tail and fled. Fourth, it had returned to its buffalo kill. Last, it had emitted a close imitation of a somber's call. All these facts individually and collectively far from indicated the actions or behavior of a man-eater, but pointed instead to an ordinary tiger, more particularly a game killer. The more I thought about it, the more doubtful I became that I had shot the man-eater. It was good for my peace of mind that, when concentrating on my struggle along the Kalyani River in the darkness, I had not had time to think of these things, or of how I had placed myself entirely in the power of the real man-eater, had he met me in those circumstances. Next morning I returned with a party of men, carried the tiger to the car and brought it to Nagapatla, where general joy prevailed at the death of the man-eater. Before skinning the beast I examined it very carefully and found it to be a flawless specimen of adult male tiger, with a beautiful coat and in perfect physical condition. This made me doubt even more that I had bagged the real man-eater. That evening I left for Bangalore, spending the night with the collector at Chittoor, to whom I recounted my misgivings, and extracted a promise that he would let me know by telegram should any human kills recur. On the afternoon of the 11th day from that date, I received his wire, stating that a woman cutting grass, just within the boundary of the reserve forest forming the Chamala Valley, and within a mile of Nagapatla, had been carried away by the man-eater. I had failed. I had shot the wrong tiger, exactly as I feared had been the case. Next morning found me journeying back to Nagapatla, arriving at the little forest bungalow late that afternoon. Early the following morning, I was shown the spot where the tiger had attacked his most recent victim. The woman had been cutting grass, which she had gathered into a bundle preparatory to carting it away on her head. This bundle she had placed beneath the shade of a tree, and was evidently in the act of tying it up when the tiger, which had stalked her from the adjacent jungle, launched his attack. Another woman, who had also been cutting grass and was about 100 yards away at the time, had heard a piercing scream and, looking up, had been in time to see a tiger disappearing into the forest with her companion in its jaws. She had fled to Nagapatla and told the tale, whence news had been conveyed to Rangampat and onwards to Chandragiri, where the Tahsildar had taken immediate steps to inform the collector at Chittoor, who in turn had telegraphed me. No attempt had been made to follow the tiger, or to rescue the woman. 3 days had now elapsed since the occurrence, and the ground was too dry to reveal any tracks. Casting around in a broad semicircle, we succeeded in finding the woman's sari, which had unraveled itself from her naked body and lay on the ground some quarter-mile away. Blood tracks we could not find, showing that the tiger had not released its original grasp of her throat, for there had been no other cries from the unfortunate victim after her first desperate scream for help. We never succeeded in locating the remains of that woman. Returning to the village, I procured the 3 remaining buffalo calves, which had been my baits on Th last visit and had been left behind. I tied one close to the roadside by the 4th milestone, one at Pulibanu, and this time I tied the third only 2 miles from Nagapatla, in the bed of the Kalyani River before it entered cultivated areas. The following morning all 3 baits were alive, but there were also tiger pugs along the Pulibanu forest road. The tiger had joined the track just before the 3rd mile, passed my bait on the 4th mile without touching it, and had left the road again at the 6th mile, shortly before reaching Pulibanu, making eastwards towards a large, stony hill, known as Monkey Hill, that jutted out from the Tirupati block. The pug marks were distinct and revealed no deformity in the animal. Nevertheless, it had passed within a few feet of my live bait, which I had tied by the roadside on the 4th mile, without even stopping to look at it, as the tracks very clearly indicated. This was certainly much more like the behavior of a man-eater, and I felt a sense of elation that at last I seemed to be up against the real thing. As I have said, the tiger had gone towards Monkey Hill. It was either sheltering on its jungle-clad slopes, or had perhaps skirted the base of the hill and rejoined the track towards Gundalpenta and Umbalmaru, and thence onward to the escarpment, further away. In any case, there was a faint chance that it might return along the road that night, and as now there was a good moon, nearing full, I determined to make an attempt to shoot the animal on this path. A large teak tree stood by the roadside some 150 yards from my bait at the 4th milestone. Like most of its kind, this tree had an upright stem practically impossible to climb, but by seating myself at its base with my back to the bole, I commanded a view of my bait, the road in both directions, and over 100 yards on all sides, since that section of the forest had suffered from fire about a year before and was therefore free of undergrowth. I took up my position by 5 p.m. As darkness set in, the moon, which had just topped the trees to the east, restored visibility by casting its pale, silvery light over the silent forest. Although in daylight I considered that the position I had selected was quite safe, nightfall had its accustomed effects, and I began thinking of the possibilities of the tiger stalking me from the rear. Common sense came to my rescue, however, and told me this was impossible, unless the tiger first saw me, or heard me, for tigers have practically no sense of smell. But to be seen or heard I would have to move first, so you may be certain I sat absolutely still and without a sound, with my back resting against that big tree. I could not smoke nor eat, but had taken the precaution of dressing warmly against the chill that would set in with the early hours of the next day. I remember that the jungle was exceptionally silent that night, leading me to conclude the tiger was not in the vicinity. As I had anticipated, the early hours brought with them a sharp drop in temperature, and as a consequence an equally sharp dew-fall, till my clothes were soaking wet and the ice-cold barrel of the rifle streamed with moisture. Several times I glanced towards my buffalo calf, to see how it was reacting. The first part of the night it spent in placidly chewing the cut grass I had provided, but in the early hours it settled down on the ground apparently to rest and get what warmth it could against the chill that had set in. Dawn eventually came to the relief of a very dispirited hunter, and I made my way back the 4 miles to Nagapatla. Here a wash, followed by steaming tea, bacon and eggs, and 2 hours snatched sleep, made me feel a new man again and fit for any eventuality. I motored up the road to Pulibanu, 2 trackers seated on each mudguard while I drove at a snail's pace, the men scanning the road as we went, but the tiger had not passed anywhere along it that night. Arriving at Pulibanu, we skirted the vicinity of the Kalyani River in both directions, as well as a mile up each of the tracks leading northwest and northeast, but again we found no evidence of the tiger's recent passing. About noon we returned to Pulibanu, where I sat down by the forest well to smoke and consider my plan of action for that night. Just across the Kalyani, and 2 furlongs from where I was sitting, grew a tamarind tree which overlooked the bifurcations in the forest paths, leading respectively to Pulibanu, and branching off northeastwards to Umbalmaru and the escarpment. I had heard that several tigers had been shot from this tree in recent years. Indeed, I had myself bagged a small leopard as it passed below me while I sat in that tree some 18 months earlier, so that I eventually decided to commit myself to the safety of its sheltering branches for the next few nights, at least while the moon was on, in preference to the danger always present while sitting on the ground. Having come to a decision, I instructed my 2 men to make a makan on the same branches I had occupied previously, and while they did so I fell fast asleep at the foot of the tree. The men knew what they were doing, and some 30 minutes later awoke me to examine their handiwork and put the few necessary final touches. I always carry the frame of a charpoi, or Indian rope cot, constructed in 2 half-sections, in the rear seat of the Studebaker. Experience has taught me that this makes the best makan. It is light but strong, makes no noise even if you move about on it, is very comfortable, and most important of all, lends itself to easy erection on any tree as a makan, easy concealment by a screen of leaves, and easy removal when the time comes to go home. Moreover, it is both cheap and portable. This charpoi had been strung across 2 branches, to which it had been securely bound with cotton rope, which I also carry for such purposes. The whole had been well concealed by twigs, which had also been built up along the sides to provide further concealment for myself. An opening had been provided through which I could see the crack where it branched immediately below me, and also some 100 yards in each direction, towards both Pulibanu and Umbalmaru. A similar opening in the screen of leaves behind me allowed me to see the road back to Nagapatla for quite 200 yards. All being to my satisfaction, I drove the men back to Nagapatla, had a hearty lunch and a further short nap till 4 p.m., when I got together the necessary blanket, water bottle, gun torch, sandwiches and tea, and returned alone to Pulibanu, where I concealed the Studebaker in a forest glade adjoining the well. Walking back to the tree, I was settled for the night before 6 p.m. The hours dragged by practically undisturbed by jungle sounds till 11 o'clock, when a panther made its sawing call from the direction of the Umbalmaru track. Aha aha, it sawed, the sound being an almost exact imitation of somebody sawing wood, the expiration and inspiration of breath at each double sound faithfully resembling the forward and backward motions of a saw in action. Then around the bend he strode, a beautiful specimen of thendu, or large forest panther, the rosettes on his hide showing up clearly in the brilliant moonlight. He walked towards the tree in which I was sitting, crossed the road below it and disappeared into the forest on the other side. Filled with admiration, I watched the pretty sight, but let the animal go, for fear of disturbing the tiger, which might hear my shot if he was anywhere in the vicinity. Nothing further turned up that night, and the following night was exceptionally uninteresting, in that I did not hear or see a thing. Returning to Nagapatla next morning, I fell asleep, but was wakened about 10 a.m., with the news that a herdsman had been killed by the tiger scarcely half an hour before. Hastily dressing and grabbing my rifle, I followed the bereaved brother of the missing man and a few others for about 3/4 of a mile down the Pulibanu road, where we branched to the right and were soon on the banks of the Kalyani River. The man had been grazing his buffaloes in this vicinity, when the tiger had sprung upon him from the thicket of rushes which here bordered the river. The man had screamed, and his brother, who was attending the same herd and driving on the stragglers, had seen the whole incident. In this case, the tiger had grasped his victim by the shoulder, so that it was possible for him to continue to scream as he was dragged away into the same bank of rushes from which the tiger had sprung. His brother had then run back to the village to spread the news, and on to the forest bungalow where I was sleeping. Reaching the actual spot from which the man had been taken, we followed into the rushes, where the slightly bent reeds indicated the direction from which the tiger had approached, while a much more evident path showed how he had left, carrying his victim in his mouth. The victim's turban lay among the reeds, after traversing which we reached the dry bed of the river. The man had possibly been struggling, or his screams may have annoyed the tiger, for he had here released his hold of the man's shoulder and probably grasped his throat. From this place a fresh blood trail became evident, as well as a drag mark, where the man's legs had trailed along the ground as the tiger hastened with its victim across the exposed sands that formed the bed of the river, into the jungle that clothed the further bank. Cautiously advancing, we traversed the dense shrubbery that immediately bordered the river on its further bank and came out on to a grassy glade. The tiger with its burden, in crossing the glade, had bent the heads of speargrass and they had not yet had time to recover. Following along land that sloped slightly upwards, I crested a long hillock, beyond which the ground dropped sharply into a small stream as it wended its way to join the Kalyani further down. I felt that the tiger would decide to begin his gruesome meal in the hidden recesses of that stream, and at the moment was in all probability engaged on this task. To follow the trail directly into the stream would be useless, as, no matter how cautiously I might move, I was bound to make some slight sound among the thorns that would put the tiger on the alert and acquaint him with the fact that he was being pursued. A man-eater in such circumstances is an extremely dangerous animal to deal with, and I knew that he had all the advantages of cover and concealment in his favor. He might decide to abandon his human victim and bolt, or even carry it with him. He might decide to remain by his kill and fight it out. Most dangerous of all, he might decide to ambush me in the thick undergrowth, by launching a rear or flank attack. Very quickly reviewing the situation, I therefore decided to cut across to my right in a diagonal fashion, enter the stream about a quarter of a mile down its course, and then work upwards along the soft sand which at least would emit no sound if I covered it on tiptoe. By this means I hoped to surprise the tiger on its kill. Retreating accordingly across the small hillock I had just crested, I bent double on its further side, where I knew I would be lost to view from the nala bed, and in this position I shuffled forward as rapidly as possible for a furlong or so. Then again cresting the ridge, I noted the direction of the stream by the undergrowth along its banks, and descended in a half-right declination to meet it a furlong further down. Eventually reaching the sandy bed, I halted for a minute to regain my breath, after moving in the doubled position I had been doing, and then, with rifle cocked and held to my shoulder, I began to tiptoe up the soft sand, keeping as much as possible to the center of the stream bed and avoiding the thickets and bushes that clothed its banks. I will always remember that nightmare walk. The stream narrowed in places to 10 yards. At its widest point it was never more than 30. I tiptoed forward slowly, every sense alert, scanning every bush and shrub on both banks, looking below them and around them, and as far as I could see. Periodically, I stopped to listen intently, but no sound disturbed the abysmal silence, like that of the land of the dead. How I longed for the slightest living sound, the chirp of an insect, or the call of a bird. Nothing but total silence enveloped me, broken only by the very faint, grating sounds of my own footsteps as I cautiously tiptoed forward along the sand. I might have progressed about half a furlong in this way when the stream took a slight turn to the left. Before reaching this point I halted in my tracks to listen, and it is well that I did so, for next instant, soundlessly and unheralded, appeared the tiger, carrying its human victim by the back, just 25 yards away. The surprise was mutual. Evidently the tiger had heard or sensed he was being followed, and without getting down properly TP's meal had decided to convey it to some remoter spot downstream. On my part, although I had moved so cautiously at every step, I had not actually anticipated meeting the tiger just yet. Inaction for both of us was only momentary, however. Dropping its prey, the tiger sank its head between its four legs, its hind legs gathering beneath it, with tail erect, tensed for the spring. At the same time the rifle spoke, the bullet striking the animal, as I later discovered, just a half-inch below the center of a straight line between the eyes. But this slight inaccuracy was sufficient to have missed the vital brain shot that would have dropped it instantly in its tracks, and with a gurgling roar it rushed forward, lurching over its victim and stumbling onward in its stunned efforts to reach me. Leaping to one side, I fired round after round into the striped form, till I stood with empty magazine before the twitching monster at my feet, from whose smashed and mangled skull the blood literally spurted in a heavy red stream. Next instant I felt faint and sick from reaction. I reached the bank, where for a moment I almost passed out. But a strong constitution came to my rescue and I was able to return to the men whom I had left on the main stream of the Kalyani. They had heard my 5 shots, which told them that now indeed the man-eater was dead. You may be interested to know that, although we examined that tiger closely, both before and after skinning, and actually held a post-mortem on the carcass, absolutely no trace could we find of any physical or functional disorder or derangement that might have caused it to become a man-eater. Here indeed was a finely proportioned adult animal, able, from all the evidence that could be gathered by external examination, to hunt its natural food, the game of the forest, or even an adopted diet in the form of cattle from the village. But it had deliberately repudiated both these forms of food to follow a perverse taste for human flesh, which had eventually resulted in encompassing its end, and incidentally, very nearly mine. Where it had originally come from nobody knew, but all were glad that it had now gone to the jungles from which there was no return. A cheer went up from the villagers who had witnessed the fight. They had finally been freed from the terror of the man-eating tiger. Anderson had saved the Chamala Valley, and his name was forever etched in the hearts of the villagers. He had proven himself to be a true hero, a man who was not afraid to face danger in order to protect others. The story of Kenneth Anderson and the striped terror of the Chamala Valley is a reminder of the power of courage and the importance of standing up for what is right. It is a story that has been passed down from generation to generation, and it will continue to inspire people for years to come. Friends, next time I will come with another thrilling story by Kenneth Anderson. Till then, bye and take care. Please don't forget to like and subscribe my channel.